Hello everyone! Today is lesson 2 on how to make comics. This time we are going through one of the most fun steps in making a comic. This will be character development, storyline, and how you can make a story. So yeah, have much fun! What you see here is one of the most important things you need to know before you make a story. What kind of a world does it take place? Is it in another dimension? Does it have other kinds of creatures? Is it in a parallel world? What kind of a timeline is it in? Is it a history-based or a future-based story, or is it present time? Do you have space? Is there some kind of religion? Is there a god? Is there no religion? Is it mixed up? What kind of state do you have? What kind of government? What kind of laws? What kind of atmosphere does the comic have? Does it have a warm atmosphere? Does it have a cold atmosphere? Does it have a little bit of the old vibe or a futuristic vibe? Do you have other kinds of humans, half-breeds? You may see them in anime or mangas, like Nekos or how are those things called, those snake creatures and all. Does it have mythological creatures? Does it have bats? Does it have animals? Does it have nature? What kind of nature? What kind of animals? This is all very important because the atmosphere in your story and what kind of story you want to make is the center of the story. If it's going to develop well, if it's flowing well, if the story is complete with the art style, everything. It all starts with the world. You may have some kind of story in your mind, but you need to work the whole world through before you even start making character designs or whatever. First, make a world for yourself. Think about every little detail, the government, everything. So if you want to develop the story further, you know what to think about. It's easy to start with a story that takes place in present time with the government you know, so you don't have to work through all those things. But if you want to do something complicated, just sketch everything out, write everything down, and make a full list of yourself, how exactly this works. This is the second most important thing, or one of the things that makes a story work. Your protagonist. Do you have one protagonist? Do you even have a protagonist? And what kind of protagonist is this? This is all about the characters you build and what kind of story you want to make. Do you want several kinds of different stories in each chapter or each volume you want to make? Do you want a main hero that you want to center the whole story about? Or do you want to have some kind of superhero squad team which centers several protagonists and sometimes builds up around other people every chapter or volume or whatever, and then let everything come together in the plot, the final plot. This is very important. When you're making some small comics, like for newspapers or whatever, or just a short story with one page, you probably don't need to think about several protagonists that much, because normally this centers one hero or person. And then the other thing you need to know, sidekick, and what kind of personality this sidekick will have. Does the character have parents, or are they dead or divorced? Or does the protagonist have parents but they aren't living with him? What kind of friends does the protagonist have? This decides a lot, character based. And what is his arch enemy? Does there is some kind of evil boss you need to defeat, or does it just have a rival in school? This is all you need to think about. Does it like animals, pets, and of course his love interest? This will decide a lot about his personality already, but you need to think his personality through too. You don't want a Kirito that's overpowered, doesn't have real emotional development, and only has a love interest that makes him more or less interesting. You need to know what kind of person it is. Is it kind of a dick? Is he too good for this world? Too kind-hearted? Is he funny? Is he clumsy? Does he have some kind of disorder like in Mirai Nikki, that they are with a lot of mental illnesses in that story itself. Is he evil? Isn't it about a hero but more like the bad guy? This all decides a lot what kind of story you want, what kind of character suits the personalities you want your character to have. The second thing, I already discussed this in the world, the timeline, and how you can make the story make the best tension inside it. Normally you have an introduction, a starting point where the hero and protagonist are being introduced. Sometimes his friends, the sidekick, or other protagonists too already, but mostly that happens in, more on the way. This can be a timeline based on chapters. It can also be a timeline based on volumes, depending on what kind of comic you want to make. Here in the Netherlands, we often have one volume of 44 pages long, at least. So this is kinda how a story like that is being designed. Does your story have flashbacks? Then you also have a timeline behind the current timeline, and you also need to think that through. I'm not very fond of timelines with flashbacks because it can work very confusing. It's best to make flashbacks in separate volumes. If people really want to get to know the character before the current timeline, you can always solve it that way. If you really want to use flashbacks, really think through how you can make it work inside the story. Other thing is building up the tension. You don't want to get stuck inside the introduction for too long. Maximum of 10 pages is sufficient enough to introduce the characters. If it takes longer, the story will get bored very quickly. Sometimes you can get away with it with a manga because those tend to have longer pages in the first few volumes, which makes the introduction more agreeable, but they also use other kinds of frames and sizes in pages and page work. You want to develop a lot of tension that you want to read further right after the introduction. That's why I draw the fire. And at the end or in the middle, you need to have some kind of plot twist to make it really interesting for the reader, that it really wants to know how the story is going to develop. This is very important because the reader needs to know exactly where you want to take him. And of course, it doesn't need to be all predictable. It has to be not predictable, but its story needs to make sense. Here you see some comics I gathered in my working space in a particular order. Before you see 3 comics made by an artist but written by a scriptwriter. So the person who drew this didn't make the story. Sometimes the artist has some minor things to say about the story, but that's not very mentionable. These 2 comics are both drawn and written by one and the same person. So they both made the story and they both drew the story. I recommend that you may look for a scriptwriter if you don't know exactly where you want to go with the story. But if you want to have the story in your own hands, or you have very specific ideas where you want to go with the story, I don't recommend hiring a writer. They aren't that expensive because most people don't do it as a full-time job, so that it's mostly not 50-50. But it's just, you need to think what exactly you want. Last but not least, character design. What kind of character you want to create depends on the story you want to have. One thing I tend to hear from people is when a character is changed later in the story. Some people may find this annoying and think this may disrupt the story, but that's not entirely true. I know a lot of examples from stories and comics who have evolved a lot in the time they have been made. Even in later volumes, they change styles completely. One of the best examples is this one, about Lucky Luke. Almost no one knows what kind of style it had in the first few volumes, but it's entirely different than the style it got to know the people so well. It's really popular, but people almost don't know the original style the artist started with. So don't be bothered if your style evolves later with the story. Of course, you can always consider redoing some of the chapters if it's like quality-wise less good. But with Lucky Luke it wasn't the quality that lacked, it was just the style that changed. And don't be bothered by it. Just draw the character a lot and be sure you are able to draw the character in every kind of position possible. You can do this by making the character or drawing the character in all kinds of different ways, even though they may not occur in the story you want to draw. Like Lucky Luke rides a horse. Maybe just draw your character on a horse. That's also a good way to practice anatomy, but just draw it in a lot of positions. I can't decide whether you're satisfied with your character or not, but just consider all the things I've spoken about in this video, and I'm sure it will land on its own 2 feet on the ground and come together perfectly fine. I hope you all enjoyed the vid. Don't forget to leave a like, comment, dislike or some advice below, and I will see you in the next class, which will conclude further development in the art style and maybe anatomy lessons. Thanks a lot.